It began as a clash between two titans, but now, it threatens to pull the whole world in. In a dramatic escalation, China has issued a bold warning: any nation aligning with the United States on trade tariffs could face serious consequences. As the Biden administration finalizes sweeping trade deals with over 70 countries, China is drawing a hard line, signaling that economic diplomacy may come at a price. In this special report, we investigate the roots of this global standoff, what's really at stake, and how your country might be caught in the crossfire. Because this isn't just a trade dispute, it's the beginning of a new chapter in global economic rivalry. To grasp the significance of China's latest threat, we must revisit the long and winding history of US-China trade relations, a rivalry decades in the making. The modern chapter of this conflict erupted in 2018, when President Donald Trump launched a tariff offensive against Beijing, citing unfair practices like forced technology transfers and state subsidies. What followed was a tit-for-tat spiral. The U.S. imposed tariffs on over $250 billion worth of Chinese goods. China responded in kind, hitting back with billions in duties on American exports. For years, these two economic giants exchanged blows, from soybeans to steel, from electronics to automobiles. Talks stalled, restarted, collapsed, and resumed again. While both nations claimed victories at various stages, businesses worldwide suffered, and uncertainty became the new normal. Then came a temporary lull, first due to fragile truce agreements, then the global distraction of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the rivalry was never resolved, only paused. In 2025, the trade war returned with renewed intensity. In a bold move, President Trump, now back in office, announced new tariffs on Chinese goods, reaching an unprecedented 145% on select imports. His message to American manufacturers was clear: decouple, reshore, and protect national interests. Beijing countered swiftly with 125% duties on key U.S. exports including grains, energy, and tech components. The economic shockwaves were immediate. Wall Street reacted sharply. The yuan slid. And across the globe, leaders began preparing for a new phase of economic turbulence. But what makes this round different isn't just the numbers, it's the reach. This time, it's not just Washington and Beijing trading blows. As the U.S. aggressively courts new trade partners, more than 70 nations, China sees itself being encircled, economically isolated. And now, with rhetoric turning to retaliation not only against America but anyone who aligns with it, the stage is set for a wider trade confrontation. This isn't just a tariff war. It's a test of influence, ideology, and economic loyalty. And the whole world is watching. What was once a trade standoff between two superpowers has now become a test of global allegiance. On April 21, 2025, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce delivered a message unlike any it had broadcast in recent memory. In a formal press briefing, the ministry warned that it would impose resolute and proportional countermeasures on any country that signs onto new U.S.-led trade agreements that harm China's core interests. The statement was not subtle. Chinese officials explicitly mentioned nations participating in coercive tariff frameworks, and said such actions would be treated as acts of economic hostility. Beijing's list of possible responses includes increased tariffs, import bans, tighter regulatory scrutiny, and exclusion from China's capital and infrastructure investments, particularly the influential Belt and Road Initiative. Why this threat now? Because the U.S. isn't just renewing a bilateral campaign. It's building a coalition. Since early 2025, the Biden administration has actively negotiated trade pacts with more than 70 nations, including emerging markets in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and long-standing allies like the EU, Japan, and South Korea. These deals are designed to reroute supply chains, incentivize friendshoring, and reduce global dependency on Chinese manufacturing. For Beijing, the implications are existential. As one Chinese policy analyst put it, this is not about tariffs. This is about containment. And so, for the first time, China is signaling that there will be a cost not only for crossing it, but for choosing sides. This is more than rhetoric. In the past, China has sanctioned Australian wine, Lithuanian goods, and even K-pop entertainers in South Korea as part of its pressure campaigns. But this new posture represents a systemic threat, a blanket policy that could be used to deter any economic alignment with Washington. Diplomatically, the tone has grown harsher. Chinese state media outlets have echoed the ministry's stance, warning smaller nations not to become pawns in a hegemonic game. The foreign ministry has doubled down, with spokespersons stating that short-term benefits from Western trade cannot outweigh the long-term consequences of economic betrayal. Privately, however, Chinese business leaders are more cautious. Some fear overreach, worrying that these threats may damage China's reputation as a stable trade partner. International chambers of commerce based in Beijing have urged moderation. Still, the strategic message is clear: Beijing is laying down an economic red line. It's a high-stakes gamble. Either nations heed the warning and tread carefully, or they challenge Beijing and risk retaliation. For countries looking to diversify their partnerships, this is not just a matter of trade, it's a geopolitical test of will. And in the emerging divide between US-led integration and China-led resistance, the next moves could define the economic map of the next decade. Why is China choosing this moment to escalate? What has changed in the global chessboard that's made Beijing abandon its usual diplomatic caution in favor of sweeping threats? To answer that, we must explore both the economic tremors inside China and the shifting plates of global trade beyond its borders. Internally, the Chinese economy is under strain unlike any time in the past 3 decades. The once mighty property sector, once contributing up to 30% of GDP, has buckled under its own weight. Giant developers have defaulted. Construction has stalled. Homebuyers have lost faith. Simultaneously, youth unemployment has soared to over 20%, and foreign direct investment, once a pillar of China's growth engine, is drying up. Multinationals are no longer expanding in China, they're quietly leaving. In this climate, Beijing needs to send a message, both to its people and to the world, that it is still in control. That it still has leverage. That it won't be sidelined by Washington's trade pivot. Externally, the catalyst is unmistakable. The US is not just decoupling, it's reconstructing the global trade order. Since 2023, the Biden administration has poured billions into domestic industry, subsidizing semiconductors, clean energy, AI research, and aggressively building alternative trade pathways. Supply chains are moving. Apple has ramped up iPhone production in India. US pharmaceutical firms are shifting facilities to Mexico. Even solar and rare earth producers are diversifying into Southeast Asia. And for many nations, the US pitch is compelling: security, stability, and a rules-based system without political strings. This is what frightens Beijing. Not just the economic losses, but the erosion of influence. For decades, China used its vast market as leverage. It drew countries closer with the promise of prosperity. But now, that gravitational pull is weakening. And so, China's latest warnings are not merely defensive, they are preemptive. Beijing wants to halt momentum before it's too late. It wants to sow doubt in the minds of foreign leaders: is the short-term gain of US trade worth the long-term risk of Chinese retaliation? The timing also aligns with political symbolism. 2025 marks the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party's founding, a moment Beijing hopes will reflect strength and international stature, not vulnerability. But the risk is real. The more China escalates its threats, the more it validates the very concerns pushing countries to diversify. Economic coercion was once a whisper in think tanks. Now, it's a headline. And therein lies the paradox: in trying to prevent isolation, China may be accelerating it. This is no longer just a policy tug-of-war. It's an ideological contest, between open trade alliances and controlled influence networks. And the world is watching, weighing, and deciding. The question is no longer whether countries will choose, but how much longer they can afford not to. As Beijing tightens its rhetoric and Washington ramps up its alliances, the world finds itself caught in a complex diplomatic dance. For some nations, the choice is clear. Japan, long a close ally of the United States, reaffirmed its commitment to deepening trade ties with Washington. Japanese officials praised the U.S. framework for its transparency and long-term stability. Yet, even Tokyo has treaded carefully, emphasizing that it seeks to avoid direct confrontation with Beijing, a neighbor, a rival, and a critical market. India, too, has embraced closer economic ties with the U.S., including expanded defense and tech cooperation. But behind closed doors, New Delhi is walking a tightrope. China remains its largest neighbor, and border tensions still simmer. India's strategy has been one of strategic ambiguity, accepting trade opportunities without alienating its powerful neighbor. The European Union is more divided. Countries like Lithuania and the Czech Republic have voiced support for a firmer stance against China, while Germany and France, more dependent on Chinese markets, are advocating for constructive engagement. The bloc's internal disagreements underscore a deeper anxiety: Europe doesn't want to choose. It wants to trade with both. Smaller economies, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia, face even tougher choices. These nations have benefited from both Chinese infrastructure projects and Western investment. Now, many are trying to avoid being seen as picking sides. In public, they speak of economic cooperation with all partners. In private, they worry about being squeezed. For Vietnam, the Philippines, Kenya, and Chile, access to diversified markets is vital for growth. U.S. trade deals offer scale, but China's Belt and Road Initiative brings roads, ports, and cash. Saying no to either power comes with real costs, and risks of retaliation. Multinational corporations, meanwhile, are urging governments to maintain access to both markets. Executives from the tech, pharmaceutical, and automotive sectors have lobbied quietly in Washington and Brussels, arguing that over-politicizing trade could damage global supply chains and slow innovation. Even Canada and Australia, staunch U.S. allies, are watching closely. Both have experienced Chinese trade punishments in recent years. And while they remain aligned with Washington, they also understand how sharp China's economic tools can be. Across the globe, a new kind of map is being drawn, not of borders, but of trust, trade, and influence. The lines are not yet clear. But every speech, every deal, every warning pushes the world closer to choosing. And for many leaders, the question is no longer if, but how to survive the fallout of when. As the geopolitical pressure mounts, we arrive at a crossroads where law, economics, and global diplomacy collide. The question now being whispered in diplomatic halls and corporate boardrooms alike is this: can China legally follow through on its threat to punish countries that engage in lawful trade with the United States? International trade law, particularly the principles upheld by the World Trade Organization, WTO, is clear on one thing: countries can protect their national interests, but they must do so within a framework of transparency, fairness, and non-discrimination. China's current stance, that it may retaliate against any country that signs U.S.-backed trade deals, could constitute a direct violation of the Most Favored Nation (MFN) rule. This principle requires all WTO members to treat each other equally in trade matters, unless formal exemptions apply. Trade experts warn that retaliating against lawful deals, particularly when the only rationale is alignment with the U.S., risks undermining the entire foundation of global commerce. It may trigger a flood of legal disputes at the WTO, or worse, erode trust in the international system altogether. But while WTO challenges are possible, enforcement is notoriously slow and politically sensitive. Many countries fear direct confrontation with Beijing. And China has, in the past, shown a willingness to leverage its economic might quietly, outside formal institutions. For multinational businesses, this uncertainty is the real crisis. CEOs and CFOs aren't waiting for WTO rulings, they're already reacting. Procurement strategies are being restructured. Investment flows are shifting. Even long-standing contracts are being reviewed through a geopolitical lens. In India and Vietnam, manufacturing companies are quietly stockpiling inventory, anticipating possible cross-border slowdowns. In Europe, auto giants are reassessing their exposure to China's regulatory landscape. In Canada and South Korea, tech firms are delaying joint ventures with Chinese suppliers pending clarity. And then there's the financial sector. The yuan has come under increased speculative pressure, while currencies of more trade-neutral nations, such as Switzerland and Singapore, are seeing capital inflows. Bond yields in emerging markets are fluctuating in response to perceived alignment with either China or the US. Economists are also warning of second-order effects. If nations begin mimicking China's approach, penalizing trade alignment as a political act, we risk entering an era of economic tribalism, where regional blocs form echo chambers of commerce. The rules-based order that governed globalization for the past 70 years could unravel into a mosaic of fragmented alliances, tariffs, and retaliations. China itself is not immune. Its credibility as a global partner is at stake. If threats become action, it may alienate emerging markets who rely on China not just for capital, but for predictability. From the African Union to Latin America, quiet discussions are already taking place. Can Beijing be trusted to separate politics from commerce? In Beijing, policymakers likely understand this risk. But in choosing to escalate, they may be betting that fear outweighs fallout. That nations will choose silence over sovereignty. Yet the global economy is not a zero-sum game. Every sanction triggers a response. Every closed door reshapes supply chains. And every breach of trust takes years, sometimes decades, to repair. At the core of this conflict is not just a battle over tariffs or treaties, it's a battle for the future of global trade itself. Will it remain open, rules-based, and multilateral? Or will it fragment into spheres of pressure and payback? As we watch this moment unfold, one thing is clear: the world's legal frameworks and economic logic are being tested like never before. And the verdict is far from written. China's economic ascent since the late 20th century has not just reshaped its own national identity, it has redefined the global economy. From the dirt roads of inland provinces to the glittering skylines of Shanghai and Shenzhen, the country has evolved into the nerve center of global manufacturing, innovation, and trade. At the heart of China's global power is leverage, economic leverage. And in the context of today's standoff, this leverage is both a shield and a sword. The most visible aspect of this power is China's vast consumer base. With a middle class now exceeding 400 million people, China is one of the most desirable markets in the world. Luxury brands, carmakers, pharmaceutical firms, and tech giants have all built business models around the assumption that China would remain open, profitable, and predictable. A single change in regulatory policy, or a minor import restriction, can send shockwaves through international stock markets. Then there's the supply chain entanglement. China is not just a producer, it's a hub for components, sub-assemblies, and logistics. Roughly 70% of the world's smartphones, 50% of textiles, and nearly all rare earth mineral refining flows through Chinese territory. Even industries in direct competition with China rely on its factories for key parts. That dependency gives Beijing a unique form of influence, one not wielded through bombs or banks, but through packaging labels and customs forms. Beijing's reach doesn't stop at exports. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has poured over $1 trillion into global infrastructure projects, spanning ports, railways, energy grids, and digital fiber networks. In Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, Chinese-built highways now link capitals to coastlines. In Europe, freight trains run from Chongqing to Duisburg. And in the Pacific, entire islands rely on Chinese telecom networks. But infrastructure is only half the story. These projects come with financing, loans, bonds, grants, often issued with few conditions, but long-term obligations. Dozens of countries now owe billions to Beijing, tying their development goals directly to Chinese goodwill. This economic architecture allows Beijing to quietly exert pressure, rerouting supply contracts, delaying funding, or freezing partnerships. However, leverage breeds expectation. And expectation, if unmet, breeds resentment. Recent years have seen growing resistance to China's economic footprint. In Kenya, major Chinese-funded highway projects have faced political scrutiny. In Sri Lanka, the handing over of Hambantota port in a debt equity swap triggered public outrage and warnings of neo-colonial entrapment. In Europe, China's acquisition of sensitive tech firms has led to calls for tighter foreign investment screening. And within China itself, economic fragility is growing. A slowing GDP, an aging population, declining birth rates, and a debt-laden local government system have all tightened the margins for global projection. Beijing may have built the scaffolding of influence, but cracks are beginning to appear in its domestic foundation. What's more, China's use of economic tools as punitive measures, banning imports, restricting companies, or sanctioning officials, has raised alarms even among traditional allies. The fear is that today's friend may become tomorrow's example. As Washington forges new coalitions, Beijing's response threatening countries for aligning with the U.S. may paradoxically push those nations faster toward the very alliances China seeks to prevent. Ultimately, China's greatest strength lies in the economic interdependence it helped to engineer. But by transforming that interdependence into intimidation, it risks accelerating its own marginalization. This is Beijing's strategic paradox. Can it defend its position without undermining the very systems that empowered its rise? And for the rest of the world, the lesson is equally stark: economic partnership cannot be blind. As China and the United States entrench themselves deeper into opposing camps of economic influence, the question hanging over every summit, every boardroom, and every parliament becomes more urgent: what happens next? This is no longer a simple trade dispute. It is a recalibration of global order, one in which economics, geopolitics, and national identities collide. In the past, trade brought countries together under a banner of shared prosperity. Today, it is becoming a battlefield where alliances are tested, and sovereignty is quietly challenged. Over the coming months and years, the global landscape will be shaped not just by policy declarations, but by 1,000 smaller decisions made in capitals across the globe. Will smaller nations, especially those in the Indo-Pacific and Global South, choose alignment, neutrality, or strategic ambiguity? For Vietnam, the Philippines, Kenya, and Peru, the stakes are immense. These countries depend on both China's infrastructure investments and America's trade opportunities. Choosing one may mean forfeiting benefits from the other. Remaining neutral could come at the cost of influence. Will the European Union be able to maintain its internal coherence, or will it splinter further into East-West, North-South divides on how to handle Beijing? Countries like Hungary and Greece lean toward pragmatism, while others, including France and the Netherlands, increasingly voice support for values-based diplomacy. Germany, the economic engine of Europe, finds itself caught between export dependency and rising political discomfort. Corporations, too, are facing an inflection point. Can they continue their China plus one strategies and preserve operations in both worlds? Or will economic nationalism and regulatory bifurcation force them into irreversible realignments? With investment capital seeking predictability, risk premiums are rising not just in developing markets, but in once stable trade corridors. Then there is China. Will it act on its warnings? A single retaliatory strike, cutting supply contracts, freezing outbound investment, or sanctioning trade partners, could change the tone of global diplomacy overnight. Yet, such actions carry enormous cost. Beijing risks transforming nervous trade partners into determined adversaries. Restraint, on the other hand, may preserve relationships, but could also be perceived as weakness. The United States, while gaining momentum with its coalition building, must also tread carefully. Its challenge is to maintain the image of a principled leader without triggering fears of dominance. Success will depend not on isolating China, but on offering a compelling, inclusive vision for a new economic future, where prosperity does not require choosing sides. At the institutional level, the next phase will see increased activity. The WTO may find itself overloaded with disputes. The IMF and World Bank may need to redefine their roles as economic arbiters and stabilizers. New frameworks, like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPF, or the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, will likely gain momentum, offering alternative models of cooperation outside the US-China binary. Yet beyond policy and platforms, something more intangible looms: the restoration, or erosion, of trust. Trust between allies. Trust between markets. Trust in the idea that globalization, while imperfect, still offers more promise than peril. Because when trust fades, fragmentation follows. And that fragmentation doesn't just affect tariffs or GDP. It reshapes the assumptions upon which peace, cooperation, and progress are built. In this volatile new era, the most consequential actors may not be the loudest or the largest, but the quiet decision-makers in middle power nations. These are the states that will tip the balance, who by embracing multilateralism, creative diplomacy, and economic diversification, might anchor a more balanced, more resilient global order. And so, as we close this deep dive into one of the most consequential turning points in modern trade history, we are left with more than just headlines. We are left with questions that demand global attention. This moment is not just about tariffs, retaliation, or geopolitical posturing. It's about the future of cooperation in an era where uncertainty has become the new constant. The choices being made today, in Beijing, in Washington, in Brussels, in Nairobi, in Hanoi, are not isolated. They are strands of a wider fabric. One tear weakens the entire weave. And the global economy, for all its scale and complexity, remains grounded in one fragile principle: trust. Trust that agreements will be honored. That institutions will endure. That prosperity will not be weaponized. Yet trust must be earned, and re-earned, in a world growing wary of power plays and economic coercion. The next phase will not be defined by dominance, but by resilience. Not by isolation, but by cooperation. Not by threats, but by vision. Because the future is not written by those who wield the loudest voice, but by those who build the strongest bridges. As nations, corporations, and individuals weigh their next steps, let this moment serve as both a warning and a reminder. That in every challenge lies an opportunity, not just to protect what we've built, but to reimagine what we can become. The question is no longer, will the world change? It is, who will shape that change, and how will history remember them? From here, we look forward, not with fear, but with clarity. Because in a world divided by design, unity is no longer optional. It is essential.